Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Toth, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished entrepreneur from Brighton, UK, Mr. Csaba Toth. Csaba, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Csaba is the founder of ICQ Global. He is a best-selling author of the book Uncommon Sense in Unusual Times, which is the hybrid book published with Marshall Goldsmith. He's an entrepreneur, a coach, a member of the Forbes Coaches Council, and a member of the Harvard Business Review Advisory Council. So, Csaba, before we talk about ICQ and your book, tell me a little bit about your own journey in brief.
Sure. I grew up in Hungary. I spent half of my life there and then half of my life in the UK. I came here for a summer, but that was more than 20 years ago, and then we're still here. I didn't know what to do, so I studied languages. I've got a master's in Italian linguistics, but I don't speak Italian anymore, so it's not that impressive. After that, I got 2 more masters, started my own company, and that's how I learned my lessons and started ICQ Global.
Amazing, amazing. So tell me a little bit about ICQ Global. I know you talk about cultural intelligence, but can you explain the concept of ICQ and why is it crucial in today's diverse workplace?
So my second master's was in international management. I specialized in Eastern and Western European joint ventures. So it was very specific. I got a good grade. And my research was about comparing the Hungarian managers with the Western Europeans. And it turned out that the gap between the 2 generations in Hungary was much bigger than the gap between the new generation and the Western Europeans, which technically contradicted everything that we learned about, what all the academics claimed. Right. Culture is country-specific and stable. And I thought, no, look at the numbers. That's not true at all. But, it's not polite to question the status quo, and then, they know what they're doing. So I forgot about it. I started my own company, a restaurant booking site. You book a table, we get the money. But it was more exciting than that. We started with 35 restaurants in Brighton, and in 1 year, we had 5,500 all over the UK. It turned into a joint venture with a software company. And even though on paper, everything made sense, in real life, it didn't. I clashed with the other CEO, who was French. We got to the point where we had to get out of the business. We sold the shares, and that's when I started my research. I got certified in a lot of different things, and I wanted to understand what went wrong, because it didn't make sense. That was the exact topic of my dissertation. That department is #1 in the world in its category. Wow. I had years of experience. How come I couldn't put that theory to practice? And my assumption was that if all of the intercultural, psychometric leadership models were correct, at least, there must be a huge overlapping part. There must be a blueprint of why people think and behave differently. Right. It turned out there is one, and ICQ Global is based on that IP that I created.
Fascinating, fascinating. And Csaba, how do psychological safety, motivational drivers, and cognitive diversity interrelated with ICQ?
So those are the 3 invisible forces that make or break a team. Those are the biomarkers of high-performing teams. Because lots of people talk about inclusion and psychological safety, and as soon as you ask them, so how do you measure them so you can intentionally and accurately optimize them? There is no answer. Or they publish another article. And the problem is that if you cannot measure something, it's very difficult to optimize it, and it's easy to ignore them. So often we try to outsource our power, and we think that psychological safety exists among team members, which is true. But this is where cultural intelligence is important, because your sense of motivation, psychological safety, depends on how you see the world, how you interpret situations. Right. And that's where cultural intelligence is really important.
Very interesting. And what would you say are some of the common misconceptions about cultural intelligence?
Oh, there are huge ones, really popular ones. A lot of people think that cultural intelligence equals international knowledge. Just because somebody used to live abroad, they go home and then they're intercultural trainers. No, they're not. Yes. They can be international storytellers. That's not the same thing. Because people can drive a car, it doesn't mean they know how to fix a car. It doesn't mean they can teach other people how to drive a car. So it's not the same thing. That is a big thing. Often people think that cultural intelligence is based on countries. And they think that now I understand how Indians think. No, you don't. What you understand is what most people conform to.
Mm.
Because the porous container of culture is country of origin, gender, and generation.
Correct.
Meaning that based on these categories, you cannot predict an individual's values and beliefs. That has nothing to do with science. And that's a problem. You cannot create a high-performing team based on passports. That has nothing to do with the science.
Absolutely. Great response. And Csaba, what challenges do organizations face when implementing the ICQ principles? And how can they overcome such challenges?
The biggest challenge is that, first of all, if you cannot see something, then a lot of people think that it's just some voodoo stuff, it's just some abstract, like psychological safety, inclusion, be nice to people. No, it's more than that.
Yeah.
And that's why often they invest in technology, something that they can hold in their hands. So this is exactly why we had to address this problem, because you can measure these things, you can make it tangible. But the problem is that when it comes to people skills, even though that's the most important part, that's how you can future-proof an organization, often it doesn't feel urgent enough. Because we need sales, we need something else. Yeah, but do you invest in your people? Not yet. And that's the biggest challenge, the lack of sense of urgency.
Well said. And how does ICQ help in reducing unnecessary friction within teams? And if possible, give me an example.
So sometimes people think that psychological safety is the same as physical comfort. And the problem is that if you have the wrong definition, it creates the wrong expectations. And next time you feel uncomfortable, you think that you are not safe. And that is not true. So growth requires the right amount of friction. And you're right, we need to remove the unnecessary ones. Unnecessary conflict arises from the lack of understanding of yourself and people who think and behave differently. And technically, that stems from the lack of cultural intelligence. Because you can see other people's behavior and you just assume their intention, and that's when things go wrong. And if you don't have the vocabulary, you don't have a common frame of reference, how do you talk about these things when political correctness is so popularized nowadays that it prevents people from talking about difficult topics? Therefore, they find it hard to find solutions and they cannot get to know each other.
Interesting. And how would you say the growth zone model complements the global DISC model, which a lot of coaches use all the time to improve team dynamics?
So the highest level of growth happens when you have psychological safety, motivation, and cognitive diversity. Cognitive diversity is the immune system of a team. That's the invisible part. That is the difficult one. But also that is the only part of diversity that has proven benefit in terms of performance, meaning the way people think, the way they process information. Global DISC is about that, understanding that. Growth zone is about creating the right environment, psychological safety and motivation. Because you can have a bunch of really smart people, but if they cannot work together, then the project is going to fail. And 70% of transformations fail. Most of the startups fail, even though they are really smart.
Well said. And my last question relating to ICQ, and then I want to move to your book. In what ways can ICQ impact overall organizational culture?
So, when we get for example, a request that we want to build culture, then sometimes I have that question that do you also want to grow personality? You have personality, you have culture in your company. Question is it conducive to achieving your goals or it's not? And if it's not, do you know how to optimize it? And that's exactly what we have to focus on. Because once you understand how something works, you can optimize it. Without it, you can just hope for the best. So you can have culture by default, whatever happens, or by design. And it's about giving people the tools, the strategies, and the techniques to optimize it. And that's the goal. So to make it sustainable.
Very interesting. So let's now talk about your book, Csaba. The book is titled Uncommon Sense in Unusual Times. And when one just reads the title of the book, one can imagine what to expect in it. But for my viewers and listeners, can you give us a brief overview of the main themes in your book?
So when you have the feeling when you talk to someone and you think just, those people have no common sense at all. They just don't get me. What is wrong with them? that we never think about the fact that probably they feel the same way about us.
Correct.
The level of frustration is the same. The reason is different. Because we often praise people who have common sense and we think they're so smart. But technically, common sense means that people think like us. And that's what we like. And this is how the brain works. That's called homophilic diversity. That we like and trust people who are similar to us. And this is what common sense is, because the brain can save energy. We can run on autopilot. So that has nothing to do with intelligence. It has much to do with familiarity.
Right.
So when we look at personal and cultural differences, then we talk about the clashes of common senses. And if that's how you look at the world, then you can remove this illusion of superiority that I'm better than you. I know the truth and I have to teach you and educate you. No, life makes sense from that point of view.
Yeah.
So let's find out what they can see that I cannot, what they know that I don't.
Wow. And how does your book address the challenges of leading in a rapidly changing world?
Well, the first step is that you have to understand what's wrong. And you have to have awareness about the topic. The problem is not when you don't know what to do, but when you think that you know what to do, and that's the wrong thing. And that is the worst thing. And if you look at, for example, the research, then often it shows that just because something is popular, something has been around for long, it doesn't mean that it's still the best practice. It doesn't mean that it's going to get you the results.
Right.
Because companies spend insane amount of money on employee engagement programs, leadership programs, without realizing that most of them were designed for the challenges of the 60s and 70s. When people had no internet, no cheap flights, nothing. New challenges require new solutions. And if you look at employee engagement scores, they are plummeting. They are back to the level where they were more than 10 years ago. Burnout rate is up by 50% if you look at the senior managers and the entry-level employees compared to last year, up by 50%.
Right.
That doesn't make sense. So we have to focus on creating the right environment, psychological safety and motivation, and give people the tools, which is cultural intelligence.
Well said. And how would you say leaders can apply the principles from your book to foster innovation within their teams?
Psychological safety is a #1 trait of high-performing teams. There's no innovation without creating that environment, because what we experience, and we work with hundreds of teams, insanely smart people, but under pressure, suddenly they work in silos. They fall apart, and all that potential is lost. So if we want to innovate, then we need ideas. We need people who are able and willing to make mistakes, and also they want to learn from it. Right. Because if there's no motivation and psychological safety, they are not going to come up with ideas. They are not going to ask for questions. They are not going to do anything. Innovation doesn't happen.
Okay. And how can leaders, or rather, what are some of the key takeaways leaders can take away from your book, Uncommon Sense and Unusual Trends?
So the first step is that often we talk about inclusion. If you are a leader, you have to create psychological safety, you have to create inclusion. But there's a real pandemic, and that is the low self-esteem. And a lot of people are struggling with it. How can you be inclusive towards others if you cannot even accept yourself?
Right.
This is what we noticed during the pandemic. That, when you go to work, you go to the office, do you know exactly what to do? You know what is rewarded, expected, what you shouldn't be doing. But when suddenly people had to work from home, they had to spend time with themselves.
Correct.
And a lot of people realize, I don't like that. I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I don't know how to motivate myself. So leadership starts with self-inclusion, which is often the missing part. Because if you know exactly who you are as a leader, you know what you stand for, and you're even okay with it. You don't have to bully anyone to feel important. You don't have to hide to feel safe. You can be yourself. If your self-esteem depends on external source of approval, then people overcompensate. And according to the CMI research in the UK, 82% of leaders are accidental, meaning that there was a good employee who got promoted into leadership role without any training, without any support.
Right.
And they are doing their best. They don't know themselves, they don't have support, and they don't know how to do it. They have an example, the previous leader, maybe, so they can copy that behavior, or they can try their best. So that is the first step. If you cannot lead yourself, how could you lead other people?
Correct.
That is step one. But a lot of programs are about managing teams without knowing how to lead yourself. And the book, especially the first half, is exactly about that.
Wow.
That's why it's a hybrid book, meaning that if you read it, you have one chapter, then you can also experience it, because for every single chapter, there is a task, there is a mission on an application. You can use it, and then you can experience it, because learning is experiential.
Fascinating. Can you tell us about an example from your book that illustrates the importance of cognitive diversity?
Yes. So you asked me about innovation. And for example, the diversity and inclusion field is on fire now. It's really important, but the problem is that often they focus on diversity, especially the superficial layer, the identity differences, ignoring the cognitive diversity, meaning that you have a bunch of different looking people who think the same way.
Correct.
There is no cognitive diversity, which means that we have a meeting, we look different, and then we learned about it, that diversity is good for the business. We all agree, it all feels right. But we don't realize that we can be individually extremely smart, but collectively blind. And we have plenty of case studies where that is the case. So that is good for marketing, because you put that picture on the website, it looks good. But when it comes to innovation, strategy, creativity, then there's no return on investment. There's a problem with that. So we have to make it work. It is uncomfortable. And that's the reason why we have to focus on. That's why it's called the immune system of a team. We can all agree that the earth is flat. It doesn't make it flat. But why would you hang out with people who disagree with you? That's not nice.
Correct.
And that's how the brain works.
Well said. So I have time for two more questions. How do you see the principles in your book evolving with future trends in business and leadership, and of course, the whole world also talking about the future of work?
Have you read The Future Leader by Jacob Morgan? So he talks about, he has that question, what we should be teaching leaders now to prepare for the future. And he asked 140 top CEOs and 14,000 employees. He got back the results and he published his book, and he came up with 9 mindsets and skills. And 8 out of the 9 mindsets and skills were directly linked to how much you understand yourself and others. The 9th one was technology. That's how important people skills are.
Right.
So the way I say that with the AI, life becomes easier, but also more stressful, because you can access information really quickly, meaning you don't have to remember, you don't have to think. That's why we are losing those skills. But also, a lot of people are going to be replaced. So there's also more pressure on leaders. AI is not going to be an inspiring leader. AI is not going to create high-performing teams. If that's the case, then we are in trouble, definitely. So the way I say that the competitive advantage is people skills. The problem is the labeling, because we call them soft skills. And that comes from the 60s, when the American psychologists had to differentiate between skills used to handle guns and metal and something to do with people in the American army. That was the problem. So there's nothing soft about them. People skills are business skills, and it becomes even more important because people are getting confused. They're getting stressed, getting frustrated, and they don't realize how much power they have. If you don't know how the mindset works, how could you optimize it? And it's becoming more and more important.
Correct. Great response. And my last question to you, what advice would you give to leaders who are struggling to adapt in an unusual time or in an unusual environment?
I think, first of all, we focus on change leadership, and change is constant. So at the end of the day, everybody's a change leader.
Yeah.
Some people have this illusion that nothing is changing. But evolution doesn't really care about that. Still, the world is changing. So the gap between the leader and the world is getting bigger and bigger until we get to that point. So certainty was always an illusion. Certainty doesn't exist in nature, yet people crave it. And if we refuse embracing reality, that's when we get stressed. Those are the kind of leaders who try to postpone the change. They pretend that nothing is changing. They're buying their time, and maybe because retirement is close, or I can get a new job. That's easy. But if you're an entrepreneur, that's a very different story.
Right.
So my suggestion is that instead of being scared, let's just embrace reality. And it makes much more sense to walk every day a little bit so you don't have to run tomorrow.
Correct.
Because gradual change or improvement or leveling up is not scary. Sudden change, unexpected change is scary. But that's why we have to differentiate between transitioning and change. Usually change comes from the outside, you react to it. But transitioning is intentional. I know exactly where I am, where I want to get to. That's intentional. That is up to me. That's motivating.
Very well said. Thank you. And on that note, Csaba, I just want to say thank you so much for talking to me about your journey. We covered a lot of ground when it came to the topic of ICQ or cultural intelligence. I think we didn't have enough time, but there is a lot of merit in my viewers and listeners to really dive deep into what ICQ is doing and the overall impact of cultural intelligence. Thank you also for speaking to me about your book, Uncommon Sense in Unusual Times. I learned several new things from you today. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.